A News 10 NBC special report. MLK 50 years later. How far have we come?
Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Deanna Dewberry.
And I'm Brett Davidson. It was one of our nation's darkest hours, the assassination of civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. After his death, the country made a promise. But how well are we keeping that promise 50 years later?
First, let's take a look back at the unrest in Rochester in the years leading up to Dr. King's death.
Cut it on, okay? Wide open.
It was a time of turmoil, a time of tension that on this day exploded. July 24th, 1964, the first of 3 days of rioting that revealed a rage unleashed. A rage the result of long simmering resentment of the institutional inequities that defined our community. Separate and unequal access to housing, health care, schools.
Most of the minority kids went to two schools, number 9 and number 3.
Schools with far fewer resources. By the mid-1960s, rage boiled over.
What happened?
The Rochester riots put the Flower City in the harsh glare of the national spotlight.
This is Darrell Porter, who's president of the Matadors.
Darrell Porter, then a teenager, remembers the riots well.
It wasn't planned or anything. We never even thought something like that would happen.
But it did happen. Looting, vandalism, destruction. In the aftermath of the riots, Fight was born, a community organization that fought for change in everything from housing to hiring.
It's a shame and it's a reproach to allow such conditions to exist.
With a name like Franklin Delano Roosevelt Florence, this minister seemed destined to inspire change. He was Fight's founder. The organization created affordable housing like Fight Square and Fight Village, which still stands today. Meanwhile, the group took its fight to the foot of corporate America, demanding equal employment opportunities of giants like Kodak, Bausch & Lomb, and Xerox. Florence has high praise for Xerox and its founder, Joe Wilson, who worked with Fight to create jobs. But he says Kodak was different.
Kodak symbolizes a straight, racist kind of operation.
The group waged a 2-year battle with Kodak. Finally, in 1967, an agreement.
The coalition that has been hammered out between Fight and Kodak.
Rochester mirrored the battles on the national front. During the spring of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched with striking sanitation workers in Memphis. The next day, on April 4th, 1968, as King stood on this hotel balcony, an assassin's bullet would kill the dreamer, but not his dream. Martin Luther King wanted to see equal economic opportunities for all people. He advocated for decent jobs and income equality.
So 50 years later, are we there? News 10 NBC's Casey Jones takes a closer look.
In a city with Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, migrant workers from the South moved north to the Flower City to get jobs.
This was a place that clearly had employment opportunities, just that they weren't extended to our people.
Discrimination turned into frustration on July 24, 1964. Matt Augustine remembers the Rochester riots making national news.
A lot of people actually refer to this not as a riot, but more as a rebellion.
It's a shame and it's a reproach.
Under the leadership of Reverend Franklin Florence, Fight was born, a group advocating for a better quality of life for people of color. In 1968, Florence partnered with Joe Wilson, the CEO of Xerox at the time, to establish Fight On Incorporated.
This is our board.
Renamed L-Trex in 1977, Augustine became the CEO in 1976.
It was a part of the idea that this would be jobs, but jobs that also had a certain amount of pride.
22 years later, there is no L-Trex, so where do we stand? The unemployment rate in Rochester for African Americans is 11%. For whites, 4%.
You go back through the years, you will see that the rate for people of color, particularly African Americans, is more than double than that of whites.
Let's dig deeper. In the Rochester City School District, 55% of staff are white. and 27% Black. That's compared to the overall Rochester population, where 46% are white and 41% Black. In the city of Rochester, 60% of city employees are white, 27% are Black.
People tend to hire people that look like them. The next thing you know, diversity is out the window.
Both Clark and Augustine agree we've made some progress, but judging from the city's more than 30% poverty rate, we still have not reached Dr. King's dream.
We have some significant problems, much similar to what they were 50 years ago when Dr. King was assassinated.
Casey Jones, News 10 NBC.
When it comes to education, there's still a lot of work to be done to end racial segregation in Rochester.
Plus the struggles people of color have in the criminal justice system. That's next.
The Supreme Court ended school segregation in 1954 with its landmark decision, Brown versus Board of Education. But still today, there is a big disparity in the number of Black children in Rochester City schools compared to those in suburban school districts. Chief Investigative Reporter Berkeley Breen takes a look.
Look at this story from the old Rochester Times-Union. It was June 20th, 1968, 2 months after Dr. King's assassination. So the 6th grade graduation for these children was devoted to him. And the story reads, "The Black boy speaks the hope of Martin Luther King, I have a dream."
You had the big line.
I did.
You had the big line.
I did.
Dana Miller was the boy. That's him in the picture. He was at school number 2 in 1968, the first integrated school in the city.
What do you remember about that experience?
Well, I remember it being very different. I actually went to a different school in the neighborhood, and so we were brought into this school to be a part of that integrated classroom.
He says integration at school number 2 was a great experience, but he also remembers the welcome committee when he got bused to Jefferson High School a few years later.
Except they were welcoming us with bats and bricks and eggs.
In 1968, 60% of city school students were white. Today, 90% of students are Black or Hispanic. And while the scores are getting better, the grades and graduations in Rochester are among the lowest in the state.
Since that time, between now and then, our school district has gotten much more segregated than it was at that point in time. Our educational performance has dropped dramatically since that time.
Dana Miller's graduation was about King. Today, there are classes about him.
My name is Gil Rosa. I'm a teacher at School Without Walls in Rochester, New York.
Gil Rosa's class video conferences with a school in Tampa, and the curriculum is about Dr. King and civil rights. It got started 2 years ago by Rochester School Board President Van White.
Why we could not wait for...
The upstairs room at his law office is devoted to Dr. King. He has the first edition of every book he wrote, and one of them is autographed.
This is going to sound ridiculous, but I feel like I'm in the presence of his greatness.
If he came to Rochester today and looked at our schools, what do you think he would think?
If he looked at our schools, I think he would be proud of our students who have overcome significant challenges. And I think rather than talk about how bad the schools are, he would build up hope first.
Berkeley Breen, News 10, NBC.
It's a discussion that still makes national headlines. The treatment of African Americans in the criminal justice system. What are the problems we're still facing in Rochester, and how can we fix them? Lynette Adams takes a look at the fight for social justice.
Since this incident happened to me, July 14th, 2013, I got a whole new outlook on the law, the system.
Phyllis Harmon says 5 years ago, she was attacked and beaten by Rochester police officers. They had answered a call from her contractor when items he was installing in her house were stolen. Harmon says without provocation, she was manhandled by the 2 uniformed officers.
I'm fighting for justice, for the truth, and the way the system is trying to hide it.
Harmon says she has been fighting to have this case heard by a judge and the officers held accountable. Last March, a federal judge ruled there was enough evidence to move forward.
America's institutional and systemic racism is still endemic to this country.
Reverend Lewis Stewart is the president of United Christian Leadership Ministry of Western New York.
It took the killings of those kids in Florida to raise the issue of gun violence becoming a conversation, right? Because their lives mattered. But our people were getting killed. The conversation was never raised because black lives do not matter.
For people of color, their introduction to the criminal justice system can begin right out here on the street with an interaction with a police officer. And that interaction can shape perception and reality. It could be the beginning of a pathway to prison.
Both those communities are very well-educated communities.
Rochester Deputy Mayor and former police chief Cedric Alexander says this country has made gains in 50 years, but says there is still work to do.
Is it truly fair if a kid that's 12, 13 years old is given a criminal record from some minor incident, he or she is now on the pathway to prison?
The Sentencing Project found that an African-American male born in 2001 has a 32% chance of going to prison, in contrast to a white male born that same year who has a 6% chance. The New York Times reported nearly 1 in 12 black men between 25 and 54 are incarcerated, as compared to 1 in 60 non-black men.
We have to find a way as a nation to make sure that those that don't want to be left behind, that want something better, we all have a responsibility to help get them there.
Lynette Adams, News 10 NBC.
Landmark legislation passed just days after Dr. King's death is aimed at protecting people from discrimination when buying or renting a home.
Has the law helped more African Americans become homeowners in Rochester? Investigative reporter Jennifer Lukey takes a look next.
The Fair Housing Act, which protects people from discrimination when they're renting, buying, or securing financing for any housing, was passed 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
It was intended to help more African Americans own homes. But as Jennifer Lukey shows us, locally, there's still a wide gap between the number of white homeowners and black homeowners.
We've started with them so long ago, you know what I mean?
Christopher Thomas always knew he'd own a home, but his first purchase didn't go as planned.
I had the credit I needed, I had the money I needed. I'd been working since I was 14 years old, so there was no reason for me to not have been allowed to purchase that first house that I wanted to purchase. But bank after bank after bank told me no.
He says when his white realtor took his financial information to a bank without him, he was approved for the loan. Take a look at these numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. Statewide, 63% of white people own a home, compared to 31% of black people. In our region, the percentage of white homeowners jumps to 73%, but the percentage of black homeowners only goes up to just 32%. And in the city of Rochester specifically, 43% of white people own homes compared to just 28% of black people.
People across the country are really concerned that African Americans make 60% of what a white person does, but in our community, it's 48%.
There's also a concentration of rental properties in the city of Rochester.
What you had was a lot of white flight from the city. We're probably the third most segregated city in the country, as well as the most concentrated in poverty of any other city our size.
The Fair Housing Act is intended to prevent discrimination among renters and home buyers, but Chris believes many black people face it today, just as he did 20 years ago.
It's subtle, it's hard to recognize, hard to point out, but if it wasn't an issue, the disparity between the rate of home ownership of African Americans and non-Hispanic white Americans wouldn't be growing or staying the same as it was even before the Fair Housing Act was put into place.
10 years ago, Chris and his wife Ty opened New to You Homes in Rochester, which specializes in first-time home sales to African American clients.
So when they come up with this listing agreement,
they have new homebuyer seminars like this one every month. Nearly all of these women will be first-generation homebuyers.
After they do it, somebody that looks like them is going to come because they don't understand that we have the opportunity to do it. It seems out of reach.
These two have stood next to nearly 500 African American families at closing.
The culmination of all of their hard work are those keys. So when we hand them those keys, it is the best feeling in the whole entire world.
A feeling they will continue to strive for. Jennifer Lukey, News 10 NBC.
Has the healthcare system improved for African Americans in our community? Stephanie Robusto takes a look in a web extra. You can find her full report on WHEC.com.
Up next, News 10 NBC sits down with the first black mayor of Rochester, what he's seen that's changed since MLK's death and what hasn't. Stay with us.
Finally tonight, where are we now and where are we going?
Those are questions News 10 NBC took to a man who made history in Rochester, becoming the first black mayor of the city. Brennan Summers sat down with former mayor Bill Johnson.
William A. Johnson, Jr.
As the 64th mayor of Rochester, Bill Johnson served the city for 11 years, from 1994 to 2005. He took over as the first black man to serve as the highest elected official in the city. And looking back now, 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King, Johnson says it's remarkable to see that as much as things have changed across the country, there's a lot that still hasn't.
And you look back on that period, and you had to hope and pray that something good would come of it. And I think temporarily something did. But to me, it's sort of fascinating that we're sort of dealing with a lot of these problems in 2018 that we were confronting in 1968.
Mayor Johnson points to what he describes as a U-turn in society that got us to where we are now, and it happened just 10 years ago.
There was a lot of resistance to President Obama's election. A lot of people could not accept it as a valid act, the birtherism movement, all that kind of stuff that erupted around that particular action. And now we're living on the flip side of that coin.
But the former mayor says the solution is not as simple as swapping out Republicans or Democrats in office.
We really have to have people now who understand the positive attributes of public policy. How do we use government to address and redress serious problems in our society? We have them.
Johnson says he has hope for a better future, seeing millions of young people fighting for change following the mass school shooting in Parkland, Florida. And that change, he says, has to come in the form of more voters going to the polls. As for his beloved Rochester, the former mayor says the focus should be on the next generation.
I said it's important for us to continue to invest in the future. All of these young people who are now in school, rather than see them grow up and move away, let's create a community that they'll feel proud of living in, that they want to raise their children and their families here, and they want to be engaged citizens. They want to give back. They want to be involved.
Brennan Summers, News 10 NBC.
We leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King in 1958. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice.
Those words hold eternal truth, and 50 years following the death of the dreamer, his fight for justice now lies with us. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Continue the conversation. You can watch or share this special report at WHEC.com.